We are in the fourth week of a series where we're going through the book of Ephesians. And Ephesians is actually a letter that we have in the New Testament that's written by the Apostle Paul to a church that he started in the city of Ephesus. And we're told in the New Testament that Paul goes to Ephesus and he stays there for a couple years. Paul's kind of best known as this traveling missionary that travels all around the Mediterranean world, and he starts these churches in these different cities that he goes to. And he stays in Ephesus for quite a while. And after he stays in Ephesus for a couple of years, he leaves and continues planting churches. Eventually, Paul gets thrown in jail, and he ends up in Rome in jail, waiting really to stand trial for his life. And so while he's in jail, he's now writing this letter back to this church in Ephesus to teach them and to encourage them. And Ephesus is a pretty significant city in the first century Roman Mediterranean world. Here's a map that just kind of shows us where Ephesus is at. It's right in the heart of the empire. And Ephesus is an important city politically, economically, and religiously. Politically, it's the Roman capital of that region. Economically, it's a port city, so you always have ships that are coming and going with cargo. There's a lot of commerce and money that flows through Ephesus. And then religiously, Ephesus is home to one of the seven wonders in the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis. So you would have people that would travel to come to this temple and worship and participate in the cult of Artemis. So Ephesus is this big, important, wealthy, influential city. And so Paul is writing this letter to encourage this church there. Hey, here's how you live as faithful followers of Jesus in the midst of this context in which you find yourselves. And the foundation of Paul's letter, what he lays out in the beginning of it, is what we call the gospel. And gospel is a word that literally means good news. That's how you would translate it. But here's the definition that we use for gospel. And I'm going to put this on the screen. The gospel is the good news that in fulfillment of Israel's story, Jesus has become king and is making the world right. So whenever you hear gospel, this is what Paul, this is what the other New Testament writers are trying to say, that when we talk about the good news of Jesus, what is the good news? That everything God said he was going to do all the way back to the beginning. Like if you go back, the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament is the story of Israel. Everything God says he's going to accomplish through Israel, like he does in Jesus, right? Jesus comes along and everywhere Israel failed, Jesus embodies it, completes it. And now because of his death, burial, and resurrection, he has ascended up into heaven and he is king. And as king, he's now working to set everything right. That's the gospel, right? That is the good news. And so Paul lays this out in the beginning of Ephesians, and then everything else in Ephesians is an implication of this. Everything else Paul's going to say is he's going to say, listen, because Jesus has become king, because he's making everything right, here's how you and I ought to live. Here's what it means to be the people of God. And so what Paul's going to talk about today is he's going to talk about like change and transformation and growth. Because a big part of Christian faith is growth. And when you talk about growth and transformation in a Christian context, the word the New Testament uses is Christ-likeness. Right, that you'll see this language in the New Testament that we are being formed into the image of Jesus. We are being conformed to look more and more like Jesus. So all over the New Testament, you get this idea that what God wants to do in our life is he wants to form us to look more like Jesus. Christ is a title used to talk about Jesus. And so growth and transformation has a goal, to look more and more like Jesus. But that's still kind of in some ways not 100% clear because Jesus is a pretty complex guy. And so when you say, okay, growth and change and transformation is supposed to look more like Jesus, well, what specifically about Jesus? And so this is what Paul's going to define really clearly here in Ephesians. He's going to say this is actually what it looks like to become more and more Christ-like. Paul's going to define for us pretty clearly, this is what Christian maturity really, really looks like. Now, before we get into what Paul says, okay, I want us to think for just a moment, how would we define specifically like Christian maturity? Like I'm going to put this question up because I want you to think about this. If I was to ask you this question, how would you answer it? Who do I think of as mature people of faith? Now, for some of us, maybe we've been a part of a church for a long time. Maybe we've been Christian. We call ourselves Christian for a long period of time. And so when we think about mature people of faith, maybe there's a person that comes to mind. maybe like a mentor or even a parent or a sibling or someone that we know really, really well. It's like, man, this person, I just think this person is like the most like Jesus. Others of us, we may not really be familiar with people like that, or maybe some of us like aren't a part of the church, so we don't have a lot of those connections, but maybe there's someone that you like know at a distance, maybe someone you've heard of, could be even, I don't know, a famous person or whatever, that this person says they're a Christian, and there's certain things you admire about them. Like, I may not know them on a personal level, but you know what? This person says they're a Christian, and I really like this about that person. I really like that about that person. So whether it's an intimate connection or kind of like a distant one, what's the criteria that you and I would use? What would you use? How would you define it? Man, when I think of someone that is like a mature person of faith, I think of this person, and this is why. This is what it is about their character, about the way they live, that makes me think that they are like a Christ-like, mature person. I used to think that it had a lot to do with how much you knew about the Bible. That the more you knew about the Bible and the more you could quote about the Bible, that was like proof that you were like a strong, mature Christian. Then I remember one day when I first went to grad school years ago, and I was in this class. It was an Old Testament history class. And so we were studying the history of Israel in the Old Testament. We were talking about kings, and we were talking about all their political ups and downs and their relationships with their neighbors, and Israel divides and gets conquered, and we were going through this whole story. And one of the things that happens pretty frequently is when you first start to like read scripture in depth, it can really cause you to like question and wrestle with what you really believe about God and about life and even about faith. Because sometimes when you grow up in a church, you may grow up like within a church in a Christian context, and you go to Sunday school and you go to church and you pick up like little bits and things like, oh, my Sunday school teacher told me this, or the pastor said this, but you don't really like read it, at least in any in-depth way. And then as you get older and you start to read it, you're like, wow, like what this says and what I believe and maybe what my Sunday school teacher told me, like what do I actually believe and what does it mean to be Christian? What is Scripture actually saying here? So a lot of times when you first start wrestling with Scripture in depth, it can create like confusion. It can create doubt. It can create sometimes like a faith crisis. Like, what is this book that I'm reading and what do I really believe? So it happens a lot when you go to school, when you study theology, when you study Scripture in like an academic context. And so we're in this class, Old Testament history, and the professor is brilliant. He's just a brilliant guy. He had a PhD in Old Testament. He knew Hebrew and all these other Semitic languages. And not only did he know the Old Testament, but he had a pretty good grasp of the New Testament. So when you would ask him questions, I mean, you could not stump this guy. He was smart. And I remember he's up there one day and he's going through, and what he was saying was interesting and fascinating, and it was a pretty small class. So we had a lot of discussion back and forth. Students could talk to each other. We could talk to the professor. And there was one girl who was sitting in the back of the class, and you could tell on this particular day, she was just really struggling. And she was kind of asking these questions of the professor and even of the rest of the class. And her questions were rooted in, like, it was pretty obvious she had grown up in church. She'd grown up in a Christian context. And again, like we said, her Sunday school teachers or her youth pastor or pastor told her one thing, but what she was reading was causing her to question that. And she was having a tough time. And probably about 2/3 of the way through the class, she actually started to break down a little bit. And she started to cry. And at first it was just a few little tears, not a lot. But as the discussion kept going, you could see she was struggling and wrestling more and more. And her crying got a little more intense and a little more intense. And by the end of the class, she was full on bawling. And she wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was just really wrestling with faith and the faith she had grown up with and what we were talking about learning in class. And I'll never forget, at the end of the class, the professor up front, he gathers up all his materials. And he goes to walk outside. And to walk outside, he had to walk down the center aisle and turn and go out the door. And her desk was right here. She was sitting right there. And she's just bawling. And at this point, there's a couple of our classmates who've gotten around her. And they're kind of patting her on the back, saying, oh, it'll be okay. We're here for you. And I was sitting just a few desks over. And I'll never forget, he walked up to her. And he looked at her and he said, I'm just doing my job. And then he walked out. And I remember thinking to myself, you are an absolute dirtbag. like you may be the smartest biblical scholar I've ever met in my life, and you're a total jerk. Now, I don't want to condemn the guy. Maybe he just had a bad day. Maybe I don't really know. But in that moment, I'm like, okay, you know so much about the Bible, but you are nothing like Jesus. So don't hear me wrong. Like, having a love for Scripture and reading Scripture and even knowing Scripture, I think is really, really important. But that doesn't mean that you are like a mature person of faith. That doesn't mean that you reflect Christ in the way that you live. So it may be important, but it's not the same as maturity. You can know a lot about the Bible and still be a total dirtbag. Another thing I used to think that kind of defined like spiritual maturity was how engaged you were at church. How involved were you at the church that you went to? And I thought, well, the more you were involved in church, the more you served at the church or did for the church, that meant like, oh, well, this makes you a better Christian. But then you and I know this, that like there's plenty of stories. You can Google it online of church members, church staff members, and church board members doing some not so great things. That you can be super involved in a church and still not be a great person. And this, I thought this was funny. I found this. This is an actual sign in a church that exists. And so if you've ever been to a Catholic church or like a more formal church, when they take communion, you'll like come to the front and the priest or the pastor will give you the communion. This is a sign up in an actual church. It says, warning, articles of value should not be left on seats whilst receiving Holy Communion. So it's this warning that says, hey, when you come up to get communion, don't leave your stuff there because the people next to you will rob you. Like, it doesn't matter that we were in church, we will straight up steal from you. So you can be like super involved in a church, you can go there all the time, you can go to all these Bible studies and programs and serve, and you can still be a jerk. So again, I think being engaged in church is a great thing, it's a helpful thing, I think it's part of what God wants from us, it's the reason Jesus created the church, but being involved in a church isn't the same as like Christ-likeness, it's not the same as like Christian maturity. So the question is, well, then what is it? What is it that actually defines that like Christian maturity where we're living more and more like Christ? And this is what Paul's going to get at. And what's interesting about Paul's definition is Paul's not going to start by telling us this is what it looks like. Paul's going to start by saying this is where it comes from. He's going to say this is where it comes from. And then what he's going to do is he's going to say because of where it comes from, this is what it looks like. The foundation of it is actually determined what it actually means. And so this is where he's going to start. Ephesians 3, verse 16. Paul says, I pray that out of his, that's God's, I pray that out of his glorious riches, he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the Lord's holy people to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. And to know this love that surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. So again, before Paul lays out, hey, this is exactly what maturity looks like, he's going to say this is where it comes from. And what he says right from the beginning is he says, what I hope for you, what I want from you is that you would be strengthened through God's Spirit in your inner being. Spirit, whenever you see that word, whether it's Spirit or Holy Spirit or any of those, that's a way of referring to the presence of God. That Paul ultimately says, he says, listen, the foundation of maturity is the result of the presence of God in our life. That it's what God does in our life. That Christian maturity, Christian growth isn't about what you and I do, it's about what God does in us through his Spirit, through his presence. That in the New Testament, when we place our life into Jesus, and when we are baptized, then God's presence comes to live within us. And Paul says that ultimately growth and transformation is the result of what God's presence is doing in our lives. Now, that doesn't mean we have no responsibility. That doesn't mean we do nothing. That doesn't mean we just sit back and like let the Spirit do its thing. Paul will say in another letter that he writes in the New Testament, Galatians, he'll say, we have to learn to walk in step with the Spirit. See, our responsibility is to cultivate a life that makes space for God's Spirit and allows us to be attentive to God's Spirit. This is why all the time we'll talk about here, and if you've ever been through Rooted, we talk about this a lot, we talk about rhythms. And you can call them spiritual disciplines or spiritual practices, but they're these habits that we live in. Right? These rhythms in the way we live our life. And when we live these rhythms, when we engage in these practices, what these practices do is they create space for God's Spirit to act. and then for us to respond to that. And so we'll talk about things like prayer and like reading scripture, but even things like service and generosity. And sometimes it's just things like confession. These are all things that we do that actually create space. They create space for God's Spirit to be present in our lives and for us to be attentive to that. That's why living in these rhythms is so important. Because when we live in these rhythms, we cultivate our life in such a way that we create space for God. We create space for his presence to move, for us to walk in step with that. And Paul's saying this is where transformation comes from. This is where growth and maturity comes from. When we are creating space for God's Spirit that lives inside of us so that his Spirit can move and that we can respond. Now, it's really important that Paul lays out the foundation of where growth and transformation comes from. Because this is really important, and I'm not trying to be judgmental or anything when I say this, but this is a distinction that Paul wants to make. Not everything that we would classify as growth, Paul would say is Christian growth. There's a lot of times where we'll say like, oh, this is what I'm learning, or this is what I've discovered, or this is what I'm becoming. And we would say like, this is my growth, this is my transformation. And Paul wouldn't deny. Paul's not saying that like, look, you're not learning things, you're not changing. But what Paul's saying is, when it comes to Christian maturity, not everything that we would say is growth is necessarily Christ-like growth. There's this idea that comes from really like within the tradition of like Western civilization, comes from things like the Enlightenment or the Scientific Revolution or even the Renaissance. These are kind of like these philosophical movements. And rooted deep in these philosophical movements is this idea that like, as long as we keep progressing as a society, things will eventually get better. It came to be known as the myth of progress. That as long as we keep moving forward, as long as we keep making technological advances, things will get better, and they'll get better, and they'll get better, and they'll get better. And so that really lays at the foundation of Western civilization as we know it, that, hey, we keep moving forward, and as we're moving forward, things are getting better and better and better. But here's an interesting quote from 1932, right? English physician Montague David Eder wrote, he said, the myth of progress states that civilization has moved, is moving, and will move in a desirable direction. One of the big assumptions of what we would classify as like liberalism is this idea that like we just keep moving forward and things keep getting better and better and better. But observably, all the progress that we have made has led to more isolation, more depression, and more despair. And so to Paul's point, when you talk about Christian formation and Christian maturity, not everything that you and I would classify as this is growth and this is transformation, Paul wouldn't say, well, that's all Christian growth and transformation. Because you can grow and transform in ways that are apart from God, that are apart from his Spirit. And so Paul's saying, listen, this is important. The foundation of faith development and faith growth and transformation is rooted in what God's Spirit is doing in and through our lives. And as you and I create space for that, as we live within these rhythms, and as we learn to discern and respond to God's Spirit, that's how we grow. That's how we mature. That's how we become more and more like Christ. And what Paul makes really clear in this passage is that the Spirit's presence in our life is rooted in God's love for us. That's what Paul talks about over and over again in that passage. He says, it's love. I want you to know God's love. And to know, Paul's not saying like, I want you to have head knowledge. Knowing in Scripture is like this, it implies intimacy. It's more like experience. Paul's saying, this is what I want you to experience. I want you to experience the love of God. I want you to experience how long and how high and how wide and deep is God's love for you. That's first and foremost what the Spirit does in our life. It's what God's presence does in our life, is it opens us up to the love of God. And specifically, God's love is most seen through his death, burial, and resurrection. Right? Paul will write in Romans 5:8, he says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this, while we were sinners, Christ died for us. This is Paul's way of kind of answering the question that he raises in Ephesians. How long and high and wide and deep is the love of God? Paul says, here it is. It's on the cross. This is where we most see God's love for us, that he comes down in the person of Jesus and he empties himself of everything and is willing to suffer and die on a cross for us. Paul says, this is what I want you to know. This is what I want you to experience. This self-emptying, self-sacrificial love that is pouring itself out for you. Paul says, this is what the presence of the Spirit, this is what it's founded on in our life. Before it does anything else, it helps us to experience the love of God. And when you talk about experiencing the love of God, if you go back to Ephesians, Paul says this in Ephesians. He says, I want us to know and experience the love of God. And he also tacks on this little phrase, and also with all of God's holy people. That when you and I, when we want to really experience the love of God, that happens in two ways. First of all, it happens through God's presence. But secondly, it happens through God's people. This is how we experience God's love, through God's presence and through God's people. Because when you talk about love, the only way you can really be loved is you have to be vulnerable with someone. Because what love looks like is me opening up a vulnerable part of myself, a part that is broken, a part that is bruised, a part that may be embarrassing, and you embracing me in my vulnerability. As long as you and I have something to hide, we cannot truly love one another. Now hear me on this. I'm not saying you should go out and confess everything to everyone. That's not what I'm saying at all. I mean, obviously you have to discern different relationships and you open up, but being vulnerable is what allows love to be possible. As long as I have something to hide, I can never fully be loved. I can never allow someone else, whether it's God or another physical person, to love me. And so experiencing love is about being vulnerable and being embraced in spite of that vulnerability. And the thing about God's presence and God's people is these two things are designed to work in tandem to one another. They're designed to push each other toward one another. That my experience of God through his Spirit and his love is meant to push me to God's people, to be open and vulnerable with God's people. And my experience with God's people is meant to push me more into the presence of God. That these things are designed to work together. And when the church is at its best, this is what happens. When the church is at its best and when we open up our vulnerability and confess our brokenness and our hurt, and God through his Spirit, man, his love just pours into us. But then through his people, his love pours into us and we're embraced and wanted as a part of a community. When those things work together, it's beautiful. But a lot of times those things don't work together. I remember years and years ago when I was a youth pastor here, we were having an event, hosting an event that was for parents. And there was someone that was going to do someone was going to do a presentation, and they were going to follow that with a Q&A. And it was going to be a panel Q&A. We're going to get a group of people up there and allow parents to ask them questions. And it wasn't really my event. Like I said, I was a youth pastor, and so I was working with junior high and high school students. My wife and I were at the time, but it wasn't really my event, but I was just kind of there to help out. And so we were talking through and planning this event. And it came to the Q&A panel and who we're going to put on the Q&A panel. And they're going back and forth. I remember one of the guys in the room, I won't tell you his name because I remember it very clearly. He looked at me and he said, "You're not going to be on this Q&A panel because you're not a parent and you don't know anything about parenting." And there was truth to it. It was kind of bold. But what he didn't know is at the exact time he said that, for the previous 3 years, my wife and I had been struggling with infertility. And actually just prior to that, a doctor had looked at my wife and said, "You will never have children." And so I tried to give as much grace as I can, but that was a devastating thing to hear in that moment. Like devastating. And I was furious. I was angry. I was hurt. And so I said nothing for the rest of that meeting. And I walked out of that meeting and I got my car and I went home and I was angry. But here's the thing. I was angry at that guy. I was angry at the church. Even though it wasn't the church, right? But it's like, hey, this guy works for the church. He represents the church. How could a church hold this view? And honestly, in that moment, I was angry at God. Why are we here? Why are we in this place? See, this is what happens. This is why the way we as followers of Jesus and the way we as a church, the posture that we take, the words that we use, the things that we say, this is why it matters. Because our actions don't just reflect us. Our actions will determine how other people see and experience God. And so when you experience the love of God through his presence, but what you experience is rejection by his people, that's going to flow back and you're going to feel rejected by God. So this is why we have to be so careful And this is why living in this is why it's so foundational, that these two things are designed to go together. That God's presence, his love, is designed to be reflected in the love of his people. And these two things constantly mutually reinforce each other. That's why churches need to be places where we can be vulnerable and still embrace one another. Because when I look at how do I know I'm loved by God? Yes, there's moments in my life of like this intense personal interaction with God where I feel loved. But you know how else I know I'm loved by God? Because of people like Linda and Kevin and JP and Darren and people that I have been vulnerable with and who have embraced me in spite of my vulnerability. It takes both of these. Right? It takes God's presence and it takes God's people. And hopefully one points to the other, and hopefully they mutually work together to get to what Paul says, so that you can know, so that you can experience the love of God. And so again, as we're talking about maturity, Paul's saying this is where it comes from. This is where maturity comes from. Maturity is rooted in God's presence, which is about his love. If we're going to grow and transform to become Christ-like people, to become mature Christian people, it's going to be founded on love. God's love in us through his Spirit and through his people. That's the foundation. So if that foundation is bad, our growth and development is going to be bad. But if that foundation is solid, Paul says, okay, this is where it comes from, that we know the depth of God's love. And it's centered on the cross. For Paul, the love of God is always centered on the cross. This is what it most looks like. And so now Paul's going to say, because this is where growth and transformation comes from, this is the foundation on which it's built, Paul's going to say, now this is what it looks like. Here's what he says, Ephesians 4, verse 1. As a prisoner of the Lord, then, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. If you go back to Ephesians 1, Paul talks about the church as the chosen people of God. So we are God's chosen people. And now what Paul says is, now you have to live a life that makes you worthy of that chosenness. You have to live up to that calling, that being God's chosen people brings with it a responsibility of being a certain kind of person in the world. Literally, the way it's translated is to walk worthy. Paul says we have to walk worthy of being God's chosen people. Paul says, and here's specifically what that looks like. It means we live with humility and with gentleness and with patience, bearing with one another in love. Humility, the fascinating thing about humility is prior to Jesus, we don't have any record of humility ever being considered a virtue. In fact, the Greek philosophers used to argue against humility. This word that's used here, this Greek word, isn't even really a word before Jesus shows up in the Greek language because it wasn't considered a good thing to do. The Greek philosophers were like, if you want to get ahead in life, if you want to succeed in life, don't be humble. You got to be self-serving. It's got to be about you. You got to go out there and make things your way and get things done and do it. You got to elevate yourself. Humility is this bad thing. If you live a humble life, you're not going to be as successful. You're not going to have all the riches and the fame and the power and all of that. So it's actually looked down upon. But then Jesus shows up, and Paul will talk about in Philippians 2, he'll say, Jesus empties himself of everything to enter into our world, into our lives, to give himself for our benefit. So in Jesus, through his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, humility becomes a virtue. It becomes this thing where my life's not about me. It's about me giving to the benefit of others. It's about me giving up my rights and privileges for the benefit of other people. But this is what maturity actually looks like. It looks like humility. It looks like emptying and lowering ourselves the way that Jesus did. And Paul says it also looks like gentleness. Gentleness is important, is not weakness. Sometimes we think of gentle people as, well, they're weak, they're pushovers. The word gentle, Aristotle, who's actually a Greek philosopher, Aristotle used to talk about gentleness, and he used to say, being a gentle person isn't never being mad, but it's also not being mad all the time. There's a strength that comes with gentleness, that you can resist and you can push back, but you do so in a way that is not harsh, in a way that's not rough, in a way that's not critical. All right, we can be the opposite of gentle is really just being a total jerk, bullying people, pushing people around. Paul says the gentleness, it's not being a jerk, but it's also not being weak. It's standing, it's having convictions. It's not letting people push you around, but it's doing it in a very kind and gentle way. A way that's not rough, a way that's not aggressive, but a way that's firm and a way that's loving. And Paul also says, yeah, and you know what else Christian maturity looks like? It looks like patience. He says, bearing with one another in love. Patience is about commitment. It's about enduring. See, we want things to be simple and quick. Like, oh, I can do this, and I can be done, and then I can move on. Paul says, yeah, that's not what maturity looks like. Christian maturity, rooted in the love of God, is about patient, faithful endurance. I didn't know for sure. I took a gamble when I did this, but I Googled this week the winner of this last Olympics, the winner of the marathon, and the winner of the 100-meter dash. And I wanted pictures of when they won. And it actually worked out really well, because here's the pictures of when they won. The one on the left up there is the 100-meter dash, and the other one is the marathon runner. And if you look at those two, like the winner of the 100-meter dash is like ready to celebrate, ready to go out and party, and ready to live life, and looks like they could run another 100 meters. I'm not saying they're not tired. I'm sure they're tired. I'm sure they're exhausted, but they're like psyched up. The winner of the marathon looks absolutely miserable. Like I think there is some celebration in that, but it's also just pure exhaustion. That like somebody get me some Gatorade because I'm about to I'm done. I'm finished. So there's exhaustion. There's tiredness. There's brokenness. There's all that. What Paul's saying is, you know what Christian maturity looks like? A marathon. Like we want it to be a sprint. We want it to be easy. When it comes to loving you, I want it to be simple. I want it to feel good. I want it to be exciting. Paul says, yeah, but if you journey through life with anyone for any period of time, in any kind of meaningful relationship, whether it's a spouse or children or a parent or a sibling or even coworkers, let's be honest, it doesn't feel like a sprint, does it? It feels like a marathon. And sometimes it's tiring. And sometimes it's exhausting, and sometimes you're spent. Sometimes you want to just fall out on your bed and collapse. You know what Paul says? That's love. That's what it looks like. That's what maturity looks like. It looks like you keep going through every obstacle, and you never give up, and you give everything you have. Because between those two pictures, the marathon runner looks far more like the cross. This picture of Jesus emptying everything and giving everything. Love, Christian love, is much more like a marathon than it is a sprint. Because it is this commitment to pour ourselves out, to endure, to stay committed, to never give up hope, and to keep going despite the obstacles. That's why Paul says in that letter to the Ephesians, we read it earlier, Paul says, you have to make every effort. I was like, it's not easy. It's not simple. It's really difficult. Because maturity is ultimately rooted in the love of God for us. And then when we experience that love, we embody that love to people around us. And we end up living the same way that Jesus did. Bob Goff has this great saying. Bob Goff says, you can tell by how your faith is going, by how well you love the people that creep you out. Christian maturity is never going to be this easy thing. It is rooted in the love of Jesus shown on the cross. And when that becomes our foundation, when we embody that, then we give to others the same way that he gave to us. Now, what Paul's talking about has a lot to do, obviously, with how we treat other people, with how we engage the world around us. But I want to turn it inward for a second. I want to look at us because this is also hugely important for us. This week, my daughter and I were just driving through town here. We were on our way here to the church. And we pulled up to this intersection, and I don't know how I missed it. There was a car in front of me that was turning right. I thought they had turned right, but they hadn't turned right. And so I was stopped there, and I took my foot off the brake and idled forward and bumped into this car. Bumped into the car, like I was going like a mile or two. Like my foot wasn't on the gas, it was just an idle. And so we pulled over into the parking lot, and everybody was okay, and there may have been a little scratch, maybe not. We exchanged information and stuff like that, and we, went on her way, I went on my way. But I was just so frustrated with myself. And my daughter, I love my daughter, but she was like, she didn't help any, because she's like, Dad, was that my first car wreck? I've never been in a car wreck before. Was that my first? And she's like telling her friend, she's like, my dad and I were in a car wreck today. And I'm like, Wreck is not the word used to describe that. Like there was no wreck, there was no damage, police cars weren't there, there was no tow truck. Like it wasn't, she's like, what's the word? And I'm like, ugh. So I was just frustrated. I was frustrated with myself because I thought that was a stupid thing and I was so angry. And even the next day when I got up, I was still so frustrated. And here's the thing about it. If when we're done here in a minute, if any one of you came up to me and you were like, dude, Scott, I idled into a car this week, and you were just beating yourself up, you know what I'd tell you? That's okay. Like, it's okay. It's not a big deal. You're not a terrible driver. You're not a horrible person. People make mistakes. Everything's okay. And the thing about it is, I would mean that. And I would want you to walk away, and I would want you to not feel guilty. I would want you to not beat yourself up. I would want you to have grace for yourself. Like, sometimes that's so easy to do for other people, but it's really hard to do for yourself. Like I can look at you and I can say, well, you're loved and you're forgiven, and I can mean it. But sometimes I can't do it for myself. Sometimes the hardest person to convince that they're actually loved is ourselves. And we wrestle with that and we struggle with that. And sometimes part of the reason we're not more loving people is because we don't think that we're worth love. And this is why Paul, I think he's so brilliant, because when Paul starts out his discussion on maturity, he doesn't start out with what it looks like. He starts out with where it comes from. He says, this is where it comes from. It comes from experiencing love. Because when you experience love, then you can embody love. This is why in Christian faith, our journey of Christian faith, whatever you want to call it, begins with us surrendering to the love of God. That's where it starts. Right, like when people would give their life to Jesus, what they would do is they would be baptized, which literally means to dunk, and they would share in Jesus' death and resurrection. And what you're doing at baptism is you're acknowledging God's love for you through the cross, that Jesus died and rose again for us. That again, the whole gospel is Jesus is making everything new, right? And Paul says if we're in Christ, we're a new creation. We become new by sharing in his death and resurrection. So baptism is about us surrendering to the love of God, the love that created the world, the love that is redeeming and saving the world, the love that is making everything new. That's where Christian faith starts. And until we can surrender to the fact that we really are loved, because so many of us, myself included, spend so much time trying to convince other people that we're worthy of love, trying to deserve love, trying to earn love, trying to pay our penance. But all that will ever do is leave you feeling empty and frustrated. Let me just tell you, you will never feel like you'll never get to that point. You'll never do something and be like, now I'm worthy. Now I deserve it. You won't. Paul says, I want you to be full. The only way you be full is you surrender yourself to the fact that you are loved, just as you are. And once we surrender to that, then we allow that love to form and to shape us and to grow and transform us. See, that's the heart of Christian faith. And today, that's what today's all about. That's why a couple times a year, we really kind of talk about baptism. Because for some of us, maybe we've never been baptized. It's not a step we've ever taken. We've never surrendered to that. And that's where it begins. That's where it starts. Baptism isn't saying like, oh, I figured everything out. Baptism is saying, no, you know what? I'm surrendering to the fact that God loves me. And I'll just be honest with you, I have to surrender to that every day. Because every day I want to tell myself, no, Scott, you're an idiot. Remember you bumped into a car this week. But every day I have to resurrender to the fact that I am loved. But it starts there. So if you've never taken that, we're going to go down to the beach in a little bit, and I invite you to come down there. But even if you can't make it to the beach, we have a warm baptistry. We can do it here. But this is where it starts. It starts with that surrendering. Because once we surrender, then we allow God to shape us into something new. We're going to sing a song as we close. So the worship team is going to come out here, and I want to invite you to stand. And as we sing this song together, I just want this song, the words are going to be on the screen, you can sing along, but maybe you just need to sit there during the song and pray. But my hope is that during this time, you realize that you are loved. And I know we struggle with that love, and that's why the New Testament says over and over again, if you want to see the love of God, look at Jesus on the cross. That's the undeniable picture of God's love for us. That's how far and how long and how wide and how deep God's love is for us, for you and for me. And that's where faith begins, with that love. Let's sing.
As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us. Come rest on us. As the Spirit was moving over the water, Spirit, come move over us. Come rest on us.
Hey, I want to thank you for being with us today. I'm going to close this in prayer and we'll be done. But before we do that, just a couple things. One, if you want to pray with somebody or you have questions, we have people down front. We already got somebody there that right down over here. So as people are making their way out, if you come down front, we'd love to pray with you, talk with you, answer any questions you may have. So please, as people are leaving, make your way down here. And also, again, just want to invite you to join us at the beach. We're going to head over there pretty quick. We got lunch. We're going to be right at like where Newland hits the state beach where it dumps onto PCH. That entrance, from what I understand, is closed, so you have to go in like at Magnolia, I think. But come back there. We'll have these big flags that say FCC. But we'd love for you to come down there. And even if you just want to celebrate with other people, you can come down and grab lunch and hang out with us and celebrate what God's going to do down there. So let me pray, and then we'll be done. Father, I thank you so much for today. Thank you for the opportunity we have to be here to gather as people from all of our diverse backgrounds. And Father, my hope is that every one of us as we walk out of here is at least thinking about your love for us. I know in my own experience that like really nothing else about Jesus really matters until I can grasp his love. We can talk through all of the other things, but until I understand that everything he did, his death, burial, resurrection, ascension, his work in making all of creation new is rooted in his love. And sometimes that's the hardest thing for us to accept about ourselves. And that's why, Father, it's really about surrendering to it. We may never fully understand it. But that's the thing about love, is love really in most cases doesn't make sense. So Father, help us to surrender to that love, to know that we are loved, because everything else in faith flows out of that. God, we love you, we thank you, we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.